Okay, well, in the previous couple of lectures in this particular unit, we looked really at how the geopolitics of the Southwest were extremely complicated at this time in the 1800s, the mid-1800s, and how the various borders were shifting as a result of various European imperialisms in the area and Euro-American imperialisms, and then, of course, also shifting because of the various different indigenous nations that were also very much a part of this larger region and were jockeying for position and power in control of different areas. In this lecture, I want to go into a bit more detail and get to know a little bit better the group of people that called themselves Americans, and as they came into the region, and as they were really relative newcomers in a lot of ways, particularly in the context of the sort of Spanish indigenous borderlands, which had really been sort of developing and evolving for at least a couple of centuries, if not more, maybe 250 years before the group of people generally calling themselves Americans kind of entered onto the scene. So let's understand why these folks were coming into the Southwest initially. But then let's also understand that this group of people was as diverse as any other group, and not only diverse, but also quite fractious too. These groups that called themselves Americans might not necessarily have had imagined a lot in common with one another, and at times might have even been in conflict with one another. And of course, the sort of prime example of that is the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s. But let's kind of try and articulate this a little bit better and understand this larger group, and look first at people who were calling themselves Texans, and look at their settlement geographies and their claims to the Southwest, and then know the group that's calling themselves the Mormons or the Latter-day Saints, and understand their settlement geographies and claims to the region as well. Arguably, it's these two groups which initially kind of exert geopolitical influence across the Southwest and make for an even more complicated geopolitical context, and make the borders even more complicated at this time. But as more and more Americans arrive in the region, in the Southwest, it's going to obviously create new cultural dynamics, new social dynamics, new borders on the landscape, but also new settlement geographies and really hierarchies that are going to be imposed on the existing residents of the region, particularly Hispanics or Mexicans and Native Americans. And in terms of settlement geography, we see this sort of most clearly in the development of dual towns and the reservation system, both of which we certainly still have today, or still have the remnants of in our region today. The first Americans to come into the Southwest were really not necessarily settlers or colonials who were coming to, stay and perhaps, create communities and create towns. Rather, they were oftentimes coming as opportunists or traders, or looking to get involved in the economic activity of what at this time was essentially northern Mexico. And so the Santa Fe Trail and other sort of well-known trails, they've been kind of memorialized and romanticized in many ways in kind of the history of the U.S. What these were really doing is they were functioning as connecting routes from the United States, from the east coast of North America, into the existing Spanish colonies, particularly in northern New Mexico. And remember, those Spanish and then later Mexican settlements in northern New Mexico were extremely remote from central Mexico. The distances were great, and so there was a demand in those colonies for goods, and particularly manufactured goods, that wasn't always being satisfied by manufacturers in Mexico City or the economic system of larger Mexico. So these early American traders realized this, and they would bring goods over to northern New Mexico, to Santa Fe and other towns. They would trade them, and then they would take back typically materials that they were producing in northern New Mexico in the Spanish and Mexican colonies to send back into the U.S. So really these initial East-West interactions were based on trading and kind of merchant trade and an economic interaction more than anything else. This really begins to change in the 1820s and into the 1830s when Mexico invites Americans into its territory of Texas, into the former province of Texas, to help settle the region. And one of the reasons why the Mexican government did this is because they were particularly concerned about other European powers encroaching on their territory, and they were particularly concerned about various indigenous nations sort of pushing back the frontier of Mexican settlement. And so they thought, well, why not invite these folks from the U.S. Into Mexico, into the province of Texas, with the stipulation that they become Mexican citizens, they become Catholics, they give up their slaves, they swear allegiance to the Mexican government. Let's invite them in. They can come and settle and make towns. They'll become loyal citizens, and they'll help to form a defense against encroaching European powers and indigenous nations that they weren't able to control at that time. And of course, as we've already learned, that sort of backfired for Mexico, and those Texans eventually gained, in their eyes, independence from Mexico. Of course, in the eyes of Mexico, they never gained independence. They were simply a province in rebellion. But nevertheless, from the perspective of the Texans, they were independent. And of course, Texas goes on to become a part of the U.S. It gets annexed into the larger U.S. and becomes a state in the U.S. But Texas, had this experience of essentially being its own independent nation for almost a decade. And in the context of Texan history, Texans remember this very well. But Texans also had sort of larger geopolitical designs on the territory of what's now the Southwest. So you can see that sort of smaller area there being demarcated of what we now think of as really just being eastern Texas. That was really the province of Texas. That's what Mexico recognized as being Texas. However, the Texans said, no, Texas is much larger. It extends to the Rio Grande and extends all the way north along the Rio Grande up into what's now New Mexico and even into what's now Colorado. So there was very much this imagination of a greater Texas that Texans had in their mind when they became their own separate independent nation and as it was being annexed into the U.S. Now, of course, the area that becomes the state of Texas is a bit different, larger than simply the province of Texas in the Spanish colonial period, but not quite as large as many Texans would have wanted in the 1800s. And you can imagine how that claim of that greater Texas was received by New Mexicans. They rejected it quite a bit. For New Mexicans, of course, that would have taken much of their territory, using the Rio Grande as the boundary all the way north up into Colorado, would have given much territory to Texas. Nevertheless, though, Don Meinig has gone back and he has articulated a kind of Texan culture region and a larger sphere of Texan influence. So Don Meinig, the same person who wrote the book about the Southwest and articulated that kind of Southwestern culture region, he's also gone in and articulated a kind of Texan culture region. And he says the core of Texan culture is in this sort of triangular area from Dallas-Fort Worth down to Houston over to San Antonio, and then from there it kind of spreads out, of course, across the state of Texas, but even into parts of New Mexico and even into Arizona and up into Colorado and elsewhere. So this sort of influence of Texan culture is really critical in the Southwest and really critical in the Southwest today. It's a sort of enduring cultural influence in the same way that we can think of a kind of Mexican cultural influence, various Native American cultural influences. This Texan influence is really, really important, really strong, particularly as it exists in southeastern New Mexico. in an area that's sometimes called Little Texas. If you're traveling around just north of El Paso, north of the panhandle of Texas, in New Mexico, that's often called the area of Little Texas because of the sort of strong cultural connections that area has to Texas. And you can kind of see this develop. Here's a map of New Mexico showing principal towns and railroads in 1890. In 1890, New Mexico was still very much a state where the majority of the population was Hispanic or Hispano in its orientation, Native American. The sort of Anglo or white American population was relatively low still at this period of time. All you have to do is kind of look at the collection of towns and place names here, and you see, particularly in upper New Mexico, the upper Rio Grande area, northern New Mexico, these are all towns with Spanish names, or names that were initially indigenous, that were kind of Spanishized by Spanish and later on Hispano settlers. You can kind of compare that map and look at where the blank space is, particularly in the southeastern part of the state, that being, of course, the Llano Estacado. But by the 1930s or so, there had been much more kind of Texan influence coming into New Mexico, much more Anglo-American white settlement, and you look particularly in the southeastern part of the state, and you don't see that many places that are sort of Spanish names in their orientation, but these are very much English American, very Texan in many ways. We have Roswell and Dexter, Hagerman, Carlsbad, Loving, Hobbs, Lovington. There you have it. So you can kind of see this development of this sort of Little Texas subregion of New Mexico and the importance of this sort of Texan culture and the overall development of the Southwest. Well, another group that's extremely important for us to understand in the context of the cultural development and the social organization of the Southwest is the Mormons, or the Latter-day Saints. And here we have a map showing the Mormon culture region, also a map that was created by Don Meinig. Don Meinig did so much of this, particularly in the American West, of mapping out these different cultures and trying to help us understand these different culture regions. So he does a similar kind of thing where he identifies a core of Mormon culture, or sort of LDS culture, and that, as you might expect, is really centered in the Wasatch Front in northern Utah, Salt Lake City, extending up to Logan and a bit south. He also identifies a domain, an area where the sort of Mormon culture is really, really strong and really important, really extending all across Utah and up into parts of Idaho, parts of Nevada, but then a larger sphere, a sphere of influence, a sphere of importance, where sort of Mormon culture has historically been important, not necessarily the dominant sort of cultural mode of organization or expression, but a very important one at that. And you can see that particularly extending into parts of northern Arizona and along eastern Arizona, and maybe a little bit into New Mexico there, as signified by that dotted line. Of course, for those of you who live in the Phoenix Valley, you know that Mesa is an extremely important site, initially a Mormon settlement, and today there's a Mormon temple there, and a really important part of the kind of larger Mormon culture region. And just in the same way that the Texans in Texas had larger kind of geopolitical designs on the Southwest, or imagined a kind of sphere of influence that extended well into the Southwest, so too did the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. And of course, their story is a really fascinating one, coming from the East Coast of the United States, and really in many cases being driven out for their religious beliefs, being driven out from places like Illinois and then Missouri, and then finally settling in Utah in the 1850s. And initially, they had designs or imagined in some cases perhaps an independent kind of nation state, the same way that the Texans did. And they imagined an independent nation state that might have been quite large. And that's what you're seeing there with that sort of squiggly black line that encompasses, what's today parts of Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado and Nevada, all of Nevada, parts of California, Southern California, even over to the coast. This was the Mormon state of Deseret. And of course, geopolitically, it didn't come to fruition. The sort of history played out much differently. But nevertheless, this did come to be an area of sort of important Mormon culture, an important part of the Mormon culture region and cultural landscape. And so you can really see how it extends into our region of the Southwest, really including much of Arizona down to the Gila River and even parts of New Mexico as well. It should be no surprise then when we look at the sort of settlement geography of Mormon culture, of LDS culture in the Southwest. It is particularly strong in Arizona, in northern Arizona, in an area that we sometimes call the Arizona Strip. This would be an area north of the Colorado River that historically was very much disconnected from the rest of the state of Arizona. It still is today, because the Grand Canyon is such a formidable physical barrier. So the Arizona Strip was an important area, and then kind of extending down along the Little Colorado River, and then into eastern Arizona, up around the contemporary area today of Lake St. John's and Alpine, and then to some extent coming into the Salt River Valley as well. So Mesa, for instance, being a really important place, town, and of course now city. And as I mentioned before, of course, Mesa is a really critical area, has a Mormon temple, and a really important piece, really important community of the larger Latter-day Saints community across the American West, and what is indeed really now kind of a global cultural pattern and global religion as well. Okay, so the group that we call the Americans, or really these various different peoples that are kind of falling into the rubric of Americans, are really quite diverse. At times, their interests don't align, and at times they actually come into conflict with one another, violent conflict. And we can see this at various different times in the kind of historical development of the Southwest in the 1800s and the early 1900s. Nevertheless, however, for a variety of reasons, the sort of cultural influence of Americans is going to become very strong in the Southwest. Both the cultural influence, the social influence, and the geopolitical influence as well. And as Americans kind of extend their sort of reach across the entirety of the Southwest and start to sort of remake the political landscape and the geopolitical landscape, it's going to have consequences for other groups of people, particularly the groups of people who had already been in the Southwest. And perhaps most significantly, for indigenous people, for Native Americans, who are going to be deploying a whole variety of different tactics and strategies in dealing with this new group that comes into the Southwest, in dealing with the Americans, sometimes dealing with them as friends and allies and working with them, other times fighting them quite resolutely as enemies and as geopolitical foes. And of course, over time, indigenous military resistance is kind of worn away, and indigenous groups aren't really able to mount, military resistance to kind of encroaching American settlement anymore. And of course, one of the things that happens, one of the kind of negotiations out of this period, is the development of the reservation system, in which it's expected that indigenous groups will confine themselves to these particular areas, these particular reservations. And it's a really complicated history, one that's really fraught and one that's extremely emotional too, because of the violence that was associated with this, the dispossession of people from the land. It really is a mark on American history, and we still live with the consequences of it, particularly here in the Southwest. For instance, remember the Chiricahua group, Chiricahua Apache, as they were sometimes called, and where they lived in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico in the larger Sky Islands region. They had a reservation that was sort of identified and articulated for them, but there was resistance to this, largely from the Mexican government, because they didn't think that the U.S. should be providing a reserve for the Chiricahua, who were still raiding into Mexico, and so eventually the Chiricahua Reserve was disbanded, and the Chiricahua people were forcibly removed from the Sky Islands region and resettled on reservations, not only outside the Sky Island region, but in many cases they were forcibly removed to Oklahoma, to the Oklahoma Territory. And so while historically the imprint of the Chiricahua people is very much on the landscape of the Sky Islands region, in the contemporary context, there is no reservation there. There are communities of people that still live there, but that kind of geopolitical connection to the land was forcibly severed as a result of war and as a result of dispossession. Each reservation in Arizona and in New Mexico, for that matter, has its own complicated, sometimes convoluted history, and we won't go into all of them here, but just understand how significant this is going to be in reshaping the settlement geographies for indigenous groups in the region. And like I said, still very much the way that the settlement geographies are shaped today. This is a map showing the development of indigenous nations, reservations, over time, 1855 to 1912. The boundaries and the shape of the reservations changed frequently over time, and you can look at the time frame on each of these here. And then, here's the legacy of that today, the way it looks on the map today. Remember that more than a quarter, about 27% of Arizona's land area is actually sovereign indigenous nations, Indian reservations. And this is significant, as we've talked about before, much more than in any other state. Of course, much less territory than these various indigenous groups, of course, once claimed. But nevertheless, it's a very significant thing in ways that sort of shapes the settlement geography of the Southwest, and particularly Arizona today. So you can look and you can see each of the reservations as they exist. The largest one by area is definitely the Navajo Reservation, the Navajo Nation, up in northeastern Arizona there. It actually extends into Utah and into New Mexico as well, and it's about the size of West Virginia. So these are very large territories, as big as some of the smaller U.S. states, and significant as well, because each of these groups has its own distinct language, its own sort of distinct history, governmental structure, you name it. So that's why we consider them these sovereign nations within Arizona. Well, the other thing that's going to happen in terms of shaping the settlement geographies of the Southwest is the imposition of what's called a dual town. And this is an interesting phenomenon that came to exist, particularly in communities where the railroad came in the late 1800s, and the railroad divided the town in some ways. And there would typically be, one side of town, maybe the north side. Maybe the railroad split the town into north and south, or into east and west. But so developed this idea of somebody being from the other side of the tracks, or being on the other side of the tracks. And what the railroad tracks, came to signify was a racial and ethnic divide between Anglo-American and between Hispanic or Mexican American. And so in so many of these cases in the Southwest, remember, when Anglo-American settlers are coming in, there are already towns, there are already settlements, there are already communities here of Hispanic and indigenous folks. And so in many cases, Anglo settlers are just building their towns and communities right next to or adjacent to existing Spanish and Mexican towns. This is most definitely the case for Tucson, which was a Spanish colonial town and fort and pueblo going back into the 1700s, and before that an O'odham village site. And of course, when Anglo-Americans arrive, they're creating their own communities here. But then when the railroad comes in, you have a division in Tucson between the north and south, between the areas to the north of the tracks and the areas to the south of the tracks in Tucson. And the areas to the south of the tracks are where the Hispanic and Mexican residents live, and areas to the north of the tracks are where the Anglo and white residents live. So here comes the sort of racial segregation of the towns in the Southwest, which is going to define settlement geography, and is going to define these communities in significant ways, really through until the middle part of the 20th century. Here's another map of that Tucson dual town. And in many cases, these creation of these dual towns are being codified by laws as well. Laws that are essentially, saying, well, if you're Mexican American, you cannot buy a house in an Anglo-American part of town, for instance, or you're not allowed to be in that part of town after dark, or what have you, or segregation in schools and churches and other community spaces. This is a really cool map because it shows the original town site of Tucson. It also shows the original kind of walled settlement. Remember, Tucson was a presidio, was a military outpost in the Spanish colonial days, and then shows as the town developed in the late 1800s and as new communities and new spaces were created. We can see this absolutely in other towns across the Southwest, Las Vegas and Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the railroad came in and these dual towns were created, where you had this separation between Anglo communities and Mexican or Hispanic communities. And this is significant because it's going to create significant fracture lines, significant social fault lines in the communities, like, as I just said, that are going to last, into the middle part of the 20th century. It's also fascinating, too, because you have this cultural mixing going on, right? And so often we kind of focus on the challenges of this when two different culture groups or multiple culture groups come together and perhaps they fight, they struggle with one another, but there's also a lot of intermixing. There's also a lot of sharing of ideas, and there's the creation of a hybridized culture. This is such a fascinating picture because it's showing a neighborhood in Tucson, really the urban landscape of Tucson. The picture's from a few years ago now. But you can see two very distinctive architectural styles right next to each other, can't you? You can see one architectural style that very much has its history in a kind of Mexican and Spanish tradition of the Southwest, and another architectural style that has its tradition in a more kind of Midwestern or East Coast Anglo-American style. And you can see the difference in those two houses. So the house on the left has a front yard, it has a front porch, right? It's set back from the street. There's a fence and a gate that goes around it. The steeply pitched roof. We call that kind of a house sort of broadly a territorial style in the Southwest in Arizona. And these were really commonly built right around the turn of the 20th century. And they suggested a kind of cultural influence of this new sort of Anglo-American expanding settlement frontier into the region. On the other hand, you have a house that is built right up to the street, right? It's flush with the street. The roof is not as steeply pitched. It has an angle to it to allow rain to fall off the top, but no need to slough off snow, right? This is Tucson. And we can't see the interior, but there's a good chance that the interior of that house might have like an interior open-air courtyard, an outdoor space that opens to the inside of the house, and that's very different from that kind of Anglo style that you see on the left. So this is a really fascinating photo, I think, that shows this kind of cultural mixing that's happening as a result of Anglo influence and Anglo settlement coming into the contemporary Southwest in this time period of the late 1800s and into the early 1900s.